And so we return to a new season and an approaching new year. And it's not too soon for us to welcome you with these words, L'Shana Tova. May the coming year be a time of blessing and joy, and most of all, healing for you, for our community, for our hurting world. Welcome to our Selichot service. Selichot is the penitential evening service on the Saturday closest to Rosh Hashanah that introduces the themes, the melodies, the contemplative atmosphere of the High Holy Days. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Blake of Westchester Reform Temple. I'm joined by Cantor Randall Schloss of Temple Israel of New Rochelle, and WRT colleagues Cantor Amanda Kleinman, Rabbi David Levy, Rabbi Daniel Reeser, Cantor Danielle Rodnitsky, and our interns, rabbinic intern Ariel Milan Polisar, who's a fifth-year rabbinical student at HUC, and third-year cantorial intern Isaac Sonnet Asor. We're so happy to be able to greet you on this last Havdalah of the year 5780, and to join as we think through what this High Holy Day season calls to us to become. So take a moment, if you are sharing your space with somebody special, somebody with whom your quarantine has been a time of reacquainting yourself in relationship, and you can greet that person, you can wish that person an almost Shavua Tov or a Shabbat Shalom. I'm looking outside, it's twilight. There are not yet 3 stars in the sky, so it's still Shabbat, but a new week is coming. And similarly, we greet all of you. Our program this evening will be split into 3 parts, one long, one short, and one long. The first part of the program will invite our clergy team here assembled, each to share a little bit of their own insights into the melodies and the meaning of the holy season. And then we will be led in a sweet, short service of Havdalah, a little moment to make a separation between Shabbat and the week to come, and of course between this year, 5780, and the year to come as we enter the last week of the year. And then we will continue without interruption after Havdalah in a worship service for Selichot, where we will all join together in prayer and in song, and in a little bit of meaning making. I'll be offering remarks later on in the evening called What I Learned About the High Holy Days from a Science Fiction Story. So let's begin.
So I'll be beginning our teaching this evening. There is a very little known but very beautiful text that we'll be focusing on this evening as we open our high holiday season with Selichot. And that text is called Shomer Yisrael, which means the guardian of Israel. It's just a little paragraph that's part of our Selichot service. We're not even including it in our liturgy this evening, but it is a part of the traditional Selichot liturgy, and it is also included as part of, the daily Tahan prayers, the prayers of supplication that give us an opportunity for confession and for repentance during our Shacharit morning service every day. So we're going to take a look at this poem together. Our focus is actually going to be on some of the beautiful melodies of this text, but we'll start by looking at the text together. I'm going to start just by reading it for everybody, and I'll read it in Hebrew so that you can sort of hear the beautiful poetry, and then I'll read it in English as well. This is what is called a Piute. It is a liturgical poem, and it was composed sometime in the Middle Ages. We don't know when it was composed. We don't know who composed it. We don't know where it was composed. And it's hard, especially to know where it was composed, because it's actually included in both Ashkenazic and Sephardic liturgy. So it really could have been composed in many places around the world. So the text begins like this. Shomer Yisrael, Shemor She'erit Yisrael, Ve'al Yovad Yisrael, Ha'omrim Shema Yisrael. And even just by hearing the sounds, you can hear the beautiful poetry of this text. Guardian of Israel, guard the remnant of Israel, lest Israel who says, Hear, O Israel, perish. Shomer goy echad, shemor she'erit am echad, ve'al yovad goy echad, ham yachadim shimcha, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. Guardian of the people that is one, guard the remnant of the nation that is one, lest the people that is one, who proclaim your unity by saying, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, perish. Shomer goy kadosh, shemor she'erit am kadosh, ve'al yovad goy kadosh, hamishalshim b'shalosh kedushot lekadosh. Guardian of a people that is holy, guard the remnant of a nation that is holy, lest the people that is holy, who assign 3 holinesses to holy, we'll talk a little more about what that means in a minute, perish. And finally, mitratze berachamim umitpayes betachanunim, hitratze v'hitpayes ledor ani, ki ein ozer. And these famous words from our High Holy Day liturgy, Avinu Mulcanu chonenu va'anenu, ki ein banu ma'asim, aseh imanu tzedaka v'chesed v'hoshienu. You who are reconciled by mercy and appeased by supplications, be reconciled and appeased for an afflicted generation, because we have no one to help. Our Father and King, be gracious to us and answer us, for we have no merit. Deal justly and kindly with us and save us. So Piute, which we just discussed, our liturgical poems, are known for being very difficult to understand, and for those who are trying to translate them, very difficult to translate. This one is particularly unique in that the Hebrew is simpler and the message is simpler, and so we're able to just focus then on the beautiful poetry and on the message. This text is most likely based on Psalm 121, the one that begins, Esai el heharim me'ayin yavo ezri. I lift my eyes to the heavens. From where does my help come? That text, which you can see right here, references God as Shomer, God as the one who protects us. You can see that in the text here, I highlighted or bolded the word shomer, the word guardian, because it's a word that actually appears 6 times in this psalm. And so the text that we're talking about today is also based on the word shomer, this idea that God is our guardian. And you see that the word shomer, that the word guardian, or the verb to guard or protect, appears and reappears throughout the text. There are a few additional references I think that are interesting and important to point out here. One is to the Shema Prayer. So you see in the second stanza, so you see in the first stanza, Guardian of Israel, guard the remnant of Israel, lest Israel who says, Hear, O Israel, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, perish. And in the second stanza, you see as well, Guardian of the people that is one, etc., lest the people that is one who proclaim your unity by saying, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, perish. So that's the first reference. The first reference is to the Shema. The second reference here is to a prayer called the Kedusha, which is part of the Amidah prayer. In that prayer, we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So 3 times we say that God is holy, holy, holy. And you see here that we're talking about the people that is holy, who assign 3 holinesses to holy, that we don't want that people to perish, and we ask for God's protection in order to achieve that goal. And finally, as we referenced before, the other piece of liturgy that's referenced here is the Avinu Mulcanu prayer that we recite so many times over the course of our High Holy Day services. And so this is a beautiful prayer that asks God to guard us, to be our protector, because we, the Jewish people, um, acknowledge God's holiness in these different ways through our prayer and through our liturgy. I think that this text is not only beautiful, but is particularly interesting because I think that sometimes the idea of God as Shomer, God as guardian, or God as protector is an idea that can be a little bit difficult for us theologically. I think, particularly in difficult times like these when we see so many suffering, the idea that God is our guardian can be difficult to believe, difficult to process, perhaps. And what's beautiful about this text is it's saying not only that God should guard us, that God should protect us, but it's saying, guardian of Israel, guard the remnant of Israel, lest Israel, who says, "Hear, O Israel," perish, right? So we're seeing that we're not only asking God for something, but that we're acknowledging a sort of covenantal relationship. We, the people of Israel, acknowledge something in God, and we hope too that God is guarding and protecting us. So the theologian Elliot Dorff wrote in a book called My People's Prayer Book, which is a series of books that help to explain pieces of our liturgy, that the argument is not quite a quid pro quo, for we cannot preserve God's existence the way God preserves ours, but it goes in that direction. You should keep faith with us just as we keep faith with you. This message resonates with me because it emphasizes for us that we're in covenant with God, that even when we're struggling with what's going on in the world, when we're struggling with God, what our responsibility is to remain in conversation with God, to remain in covenant, that we continue to acknowledge God. We pray too that God continues to protect and to acknowledge us. So I'm going to sing selections from two settings of this text, Shomer Israel. It's really interesting because this text is such a minor part of our liturgy, but it's so beautiful that so many composers have jumped on the opportunity to compose settings of this text. And so I've picked just two of them. The first is by cantor Israel Goldstein, who is a cantor living today. He's retired from a congregation on Long Island and is a teacher of cantorial studies at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music. That's a mouthful. And he composed this beautiful text of Shomer Israel. It's a choral text, actually, but he composed a solo version of it, too. And so I'm going to sing just a little selection of that for you. Shomer Israel, Shemor Sherit Yisrael, Ve'al Yovad Yisrael, Amrim Shema Yisrael, Shomer Shemor Sherit Yisrael, Ve'al Yovad Yisrael, Amrim Shema Yisrael, Shomer Kol Echad, Shemor Sherit Am Echad, Yovad Goy Echad, Miachachadim Shimcha, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Shomer Goy Kadosh, Shemor Sheritam Kadosh, Ve'al Yovad Goy Kadosh, Hamshashim B'Shalosh, Kedushot lekadosh, Shomer So this beautiful text reminds me of a lullaby. It's a very sweet text. The other setting that I am going to be singing is a composition by the incredibly famous cantor Yasala Rosenblatt. Um, he was in the tradition of Eastern European cantors who were such an important part of synagogue life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Yasala Rosenblatt was perhaps the most famous one. He lived from the 1880s until the early 1930s. And so this is a text in the traditional style of chazanut, of traditional cantorial music in the Jewish modes. And this one, I think, has much less of a sound of a lullaby. I hear some questioning in it. I'd be curious to hear what all of you think as well. But this is just a little selection of a setting of Shomer Yisrael by Yasala Rosenblatt. Shomer Yisrael, Shemor Sherit Yisrael, Shomer Yisrael, Shemor Sherit Yisrael, Ve'al Yovad Yisrael, Ve'al Yovad Yisrael, Aomrim Shema, Aomrim Shema, Aomrim Shema Yisrael, Shomer Goy Echad, Shemor She'erit Am Echad, Shemor She'erit, Shemor She'erit, She'erit Am Echad, Ve'al Yovad Goy Echad, Ve'al Yovad Goy Echad, Am Yachadim Shemcha Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So you can hear in that text a real sense of longing, for God. And so I hope that this has been an opportunity to get to know a not very well known, but very beautiful piece of our Selichot liturgy that perhaps you'll encounter in a future year in a Selichot service, or will know to look out for the next time that you are praying in a weekday morning service as well. And so with that, I will wish you all a Shana Tova as I turn it over to my next colleague.
Thanks so much, Cantor Kleinman. So I am going to lead a teaching this evening on a topic that I'll share with you with a title slide here. So we're going to be talking about universalism, the High Holy Days, and the coronavirus. So that's just a little teaser for what it is we're going to get into together. And let me say a few opening words about those first two elements, about universalism and the High Holy Days. There's a saying by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg that maybe the reason why Jews show up in extraordinary numbers on the High Holy Days, unlike any other synagogue-based holiday, it's the holiday that has the greatest participation of Jews in America. Now, let's remember, by the way, that Passover actually is the most observed Jewish holiday, but that's a home-based holiday. Of all of the synagogue-based holidays, the High Holy Days is by far and away the most well-attended, well-participated in Jewish holiday of our year. And Rabbi Yitz Greenberg says that maybe one reason why this is the case is not only because these holidays have the word high in front of them, and thereby seems to indicate some sort of elevated special status. There might be a deeper reason, says Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. He believes that another reason why the High Holy Days are as well attended as they are is because they have a universal message. It's one of our holidays that's actually not all that concerned about the particularity of this tribe called the Jewish people. Notice that all of the things we atone for on Yom Kippur are human sins, not so-called Jewish sins. We never say, for the sin I committed against you by not keeping kosher, or by the sin I committed against you by not observing the Shabbat, or by not doing enough Talmud Torah, not enough Jewish learning. Those aren't the things that we're asking for forgiveness about on the High Holy Days. Rather, they are not particularly Jewish things, but universally human things. For the sin I committed against you by gossiping, for the sin I committed against you by slander, by not being true to myself, by being false in my relationships. The High Holy Days have a universalistic message, something that can appeal to anybody, anywhere, whether they're Jewish or not. It just so happens to be couched in the language of the Jewish people, using Jewish rituals and Jewish customs, but the message is truly a universal one that speaks to the human condition, not just the Jewish experience of the human condition. And a young person who I once knew, or rather a rabbi who I'm friends with, tells me that their kid once asked them the following question. This rabbi friend of mine says, my son asked me this really good question the other day. My son said, all of the other Jewish holidays have a very clear story that goes along with them. On Passover, we tell the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. On Purim, we tell the story of Esther and Mordecai saving the Jewish people of Persia. On Hanukkah, we tell the story of the Maccabees rising up against the Syrian Greeks and saving the day. What's the story? This rabbi's child asked her. What's the story of the High Holy Days? And this rabbi said, it's a really good question to her son. And thinking it over, and I'm not sure she said this in the present moment because no one is quite this articulate in the present moment, especially when it comes to kids. But thinking it over, this rabbi eventually returned to her kid and said, do you know what the story is on the High Holy Days? You are. Your life story is the story on the High Holy Days. We don't need to look in a book. We don't need to learn about any characters and what happened to them and when they lived and why they did the things they did. All we need to know about is ourselves, our own story. And there's sort of an interesting dialectic there that on the one hand, the High Holy Days have this universal message, and on the other hand, they're concerned with the specifically individual human, sort of missing on the spectrum of identities, that middle ring of group identity, of Jewish particularism. There's the individual and there's the universal, but it skips that layer of Jewish group identity. In fact, the best pathway to the universal is through the individual, and that's probably why we skip that second ring. Things that are universal have to be universally true for all individuals, and that's why we ourselves are the story on the High Holy Days, as opposed to a story that happened to our people. We focus on our own personal story in order to ask universal questions about the human condition. Okay, all of that was just a setup to help us get into the High Holy Days, universalism, and the coronavirus. So, when this pandemic first began, it began in China. I remember I was in December, I was visiting a friend in the hospital, and I saw like a pop-up on my phone that said, an epidemic is spreading in the central Chinese city of Wuhan, and it's getting to be like a big thing here in the city of Wuhan. And I was like, oh, that's happening far away, in a faraway place. And it sounds like it's a big deal and big news over there, but that's a problem over there in that part of the world, maybe contained to this one city, at worst contained to that one country. That's not our problem. What we're looking at right now is a map of cumulative coronavirus cases as of January 23rd. And you can see based on the key here at the top that the lighter yellow color, the map, the fewer number of cases, the darker orange and brownish colors are more cumulative cases. So here's what the world looked like regarding cumulative cases, or at least documented cumulative cases of coronavirus by the end of January, when we still thought that this was maybe like an isolated thing that was just in one country. But today, this statistic is as recent as Thursday. Here's what our world looks like. what had been initially something that was an isolated thing, far away in one city, in one faraway country, very quickly spread all over the world and has since infected millions of people all around the globe. It turns out that, kind of like the High Holy Days, which has a message that's universal, that's not particular to any one place or any one people, similarly, the coronavirus has reached all pockets of our world, not just people who speak one language or subscribe to one particular belief system or who enact a certain set of rituals. The coronavirus has proven truly universal. And it's interesting because at first, the way that some governments responded to this crisis was by trying to raise the walls, by trying to shut off the borders, by trying to keep this thing out, by keeping others out, by trying to keep the virus away. We thought that the way to keep ourselves safe was to raise up the walls. And in fact, that proved not to be effective. The virus seemed more able to pass through what we thought were firm boundaries, but turned out to actually be porous boundaries, both national boundaries, but also the boundaries between people. We discovered that it spreads much more easily than we ever realized, that the connection between me and you is a lot greater, a lot deeper, a lot more enmeshed and integrated than we ever realized. Even just being within 6 feet of each other means that we are now mixed up in one another, and something that I have, something that I'm carrying, you can easily get. That we're connected, that there's not really the same kind of boundary between us that we might have thought there was. Just like there aren't clear boundaries, and these lines on this map aren't actual demarcations, they're just borders that governments have made. The virus was able to spread between countries, between people, universally, despite our best efforts otherwise. And this reminds me of a certain piece of liturgy that we offer on the High Holy Days, one of our centermost pieces of liturgy from the High Holy Days, and that's, of course, the Unatana Tokef prayer. I've brought here one paragraph from Unatana Tokef, which expresses in its own poetic way, in its own language and imagery and symbols, the idea of universalism, how what happens to one of us actually is happening to all of us, how the human condition is not something that I experience by myself, but actually something that all of us are experiencing. So here's the selection from Unatana Tokef. Uveshofar gadol yitaka, v'kol d'mama daka yishama, umalachim yechafezun, v'chil ureada yochezun, v'yomru hine yom hadin, ki lo yizku be'einecha badin, v'chol ba'e olam ya'avrun lefanecha kivnei maron. Kevakarat ro'eh Edro ma'avir tsono tachat shivto, ken ta'avir v'tispor v'timneh, v'tifkod nefesh kol chai, v'tachtoch kitzva l'chol bria, v'tichtov et gzar dinam. That was a little practice on my Hebrew, making sure I'm ready for the holidays that are coming. So here we go. And so a great shofar will cry tekiyah. A still small voice will be heard. Angels in a whirl of fear and trembling will say, behold the day of judgment, for they too are judged. In your eyes, even they are not blameless. Okay, let's pause right there. This poem that we read so centrally on the High Holy Days says that Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah are in fact so universal that it's not just about me. It's not just about me and you. It's not just about the Jewish people. It's not just about all of the human family. In fact, it's about every living thing. Indeed, even the angels are judged on Yom Kippur. For in God's eyes, even the angels are not blameless. Just like the coronavirus has reached to every corner of our world, passing, by the way, not only between humans, but even between species of other animals. Similarly, on Yom Kippur, we recognize that everything in creation is connected and that all things are called to account on Yom Kippur. Let's continue. All who come into the world pass before you like sheep before their shepherd. As a shepherd considers the flock when it passes beneath the staff, you count and consider the souls of all living things and decree a limit to each one's days and inscribe their final judgment. And here, of course, is a painful part of how the coronavirus has reminded us of the High Holy Days, which is that on the High Holy Days, one part of the human condition, one part of the universal experience that every single one of us is a part of, is coming to terms with the fact that we are vulnerable, that bad things will happen to us when we don't expect them to, and that all of us will have an end. There will be a decree, a limit to each one of our days, and there will come a time that our lives will end. The coronavirus has brought that reality into all too painful high relief, that sort of randomness that comes along with life that Cantor Kleinman spoke about just a minute ago, but just which makes it so hard for us to affirm God. When bad things happen, it's hard for us to understand how there could be any sort of plan, how there could be any sort of loving being out there that cares about us and wants the best for us. But on the high holy days, we affirm the vulnerability of being alive, the fact that bad things can happen to us, as we saw all too painfully with the spread of this virus, which affected young and old alike, healthy and infirm. So let's continue looking at one other way in which the coronavirus might remind us of the high holy days and of some of the things that we are reminding ourselves about on those days. So this comes from the world of medical learning and of medical nomenclature. I found this little tidbit that the reason it's called the coronavirus is because it, of course, belongs to the category of viruses called coronaviruses. This isn't the only coronavirus that's out there. This is one particular novel, new coronavirus. And that grouping of viruses gets its name from the club-shaped spikes on the virus's spherical surface have earned it the name coronavirus, derived from the Latin word for crown or corona. Now, of course, if you've been to synagogue before on the high holy days, then the image of a crown might point you in the direction of what this reminds us of, which is that on the high holy days, one of our central metaphors for God is of God as sovereign, God as king or queen, God as ruler, God as one who wears a crown. And the coronavirus is similarly in that realm of things that are in the image of sovereignty on account of its name, crown, corona. And this reminds me actually back of our map a couple of pages ago, a couple of slides ago, which is that we've created all of these borders and boundaries saying, okay, like this is my country, that one's yours, like this is our people and that's like not our people. And the coronavirus has shown us actually that those boundaries are much more permeable than we realized, that the boundaries aren't quite as real as we'd like them to be. And that's what we're affirming when we call God Mulcanu, when we say that God is like a king or a queen, that God is a sovereign or a ruler. We're affirming that there is a power that's bigger than the power of governments. We think that these are the boundaries of the world because we've set them up this way, but these boundaries are totally false. They're totally imaginary. We've made them up. The real power in the world transcends all of them. The real power in the world is God, who we think of as our creator and who has dominion over all of us, no matter where we live, no matter what people we belong to. And that is the most powerful thing, not our own little isolated cells, our own little isolated blocks, whether that's a national block or tribal blocks. So I want to leave us maybe with just one last set of thoughts, which comes from my beloved teacher, Rabbi Dr. Larry Hoffman. He's been scholar in residence at WRT many times in the past, including just last year on the High Holy Days. This is from his book, All the World, which is a series or part of a series about the liturgy of the High Holy Days. And this particular part of that series deals with the concept of universalism as it's expressed in the High Holy Days. I know that there's a lot of text here. I'm just going to read it, and then we will have a chance to unpack it a little bit, and then I'll conclude. So, in the evolution of human societies, writes Rabbi Dr. Hoffman, in the evolution of human societies, particularism came first, meaning the first thing that we ascribed, the first groups that we found were our tribal groups. The first thing was particularism, the solidarity of small groups that arose in prehistoric times and eventually matured into tribal societies, each with its own culture, language, religion, and categories of thought. Before I could feel myself to be a member of the human race, I first had to think of myself as a member of my own little tribal family. They are what anthropologists traditionally study in their fieldwork, but not on that account limited to so-called primitives. When the anthropologists return to their own communities, they experience the same sense of knowing they are home. the way even the most intrepid traveler does when the plane hits familiar tarmac and you feel once again that you are on familiar ground. In its rawest form, it is the sense of knowing you are among us rather than them. Okay, so the first thing that we learn is in-group identity. And there's a certain familiarity that we feel when we're with that own group. That comes first in our human development, both as individuals, but also in our historic evolution. Rabbi Hoffman goes on to write, eventually, all but the most isolated tribal units become aware of their neighbors, not just us, but them too, and discover that to some degree at least, these strangers are not just them, but rather are an extension of us, an expression of humanity at large. In Western culture, the high point in this turn to universalism occurred in the 18th century phenomenon that we call the Enlightenment, an extension of the prior century's turn to science. The Enlightenment period was the time of the greatest universalism, Rabbi Hoffman is arguing here. Scientific principles are, by definition, universal. They hold everywhere. Gravity is the exact same right here as it is in Wuhan, China. Scientific principles play no favorites. The language of mathematics holds everywhere in the universe, no matter where we live upon it. We can all read it. 1 + 1 is 2 on Earth as it is on the moon. Even the angels are gripped with fear and trembling. This applies to all parts of the universe. Last piece from Larry Hoffman. To be human is to know firsthand these two perspectives, both universalism and particularism. The first, an extended feeling of kinship with all humanity. The second, the natural tendency to feel most at home with our own kind. They derive from the same source, the basic human need to reach beyond ourselves and affirm relationships with others, whether those relationships are in our own group or in the wider universal human group. But they need not go together, and in fact, they may sometimes even be in conflict. There can hardly be a more important issue for our time than the need to balance the two. And that important issue of balancing in-group versus outside group, of balancing our own tribe with the human family, is something that our whole world has been wrestling with, not just in the coronavirus, although I would say especially so in the coronavirus, but certainly longer than that, for the past handful of years. How we both feel proud of who it is that we are without demonizing who they are, how we can come together as a human family and not just as our Jewish family. And that's one thing that the High Holy Days, I believe, is trying to teach us, is that the best way to be human on this earth is to be human. We don't need to worry exclusively about our Jewish selves. This is a time for worrying about our human selves, whether that is here where I am in White Plains or somewhere far, far across the world. So I wish us all a Shana Tova, and I will turn it over to our next teacher.
Thank you very much. I am Cantor Randall Schloss. I am the cantor at Temple Israel of New Rochelle. And first of all, I just want to thank Westchester Reform Temple and thank all the clergy at WRT for joining with us and allowing not only us as colleagues to come together on the Selichot, but our communities to come together as well. And I know we're not able to physically come together as we have many times in the past, but it's nice even in this online space for us to share together. So thank you. Cantor Kleinman gave us a text that she described as, a little known text, but beautiful text nonetheless. And what I'm going to look at is quite the opposite. I think a text that is quite well known, but we're going to look at it in enough detail that I hope it will offer some new insights about what it has to say to us, and specifically what it has to say to us musically. So that text, even though it's a common text, in fact, it is something that we say every single time we read Torah and when we return Torah. So it shows up weekly, but it's certainly a seminal text of this time of the days of awe of the high holidays as well. And that text is Hashivenu. So I'm going to open it up. We're going to look at actually its original source before we get into some more detail about this one line of Hashivenu. So let me see if I can quickly share my screen. It's going to be here somewhere. Okay. So this text of Hashivenu actually comes from us from the book of Lamentations, which is not the most common source for our liturgy. Whether it's high holiday liturgy or Shabbat liturgy, weekly liturgy, the festivals, whatever it is, our liturgy comes from a variety of sources, from the Psalms, from the prophets, certainly from Torah, and then it added into it is all sorts of rabbinic prayer and prayer that's been added over the centuries. Some of it is ancient, some of it much newer, some poems, Piute from medieval times. But here we have a line from the Book of Lamentations. And if you're not familiar with the Book of Lamentations, it's the scroll that is associated most closely, actually, with Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, that national Jewish day of mourning, where our tradition tells us that both the first and second temples, as well as many other tragic events in the history of the Jewish people, happened on the 9th of Av. So it's that lowest point in our calendar, and it was so about 6 weeks ago at this point, but it's 7 weeks from the 9th of Av until we arrive at Rosh Hashanah. So we, on Tisha B'Av, we read the Book of Lamentations, which I've given you 3 verses here. The middle one is the one we're going to focus on for tonight, but I wanted to give you a little bit of the context of where it comes from Lamentations. So this first one, Lama lenetzach tishkachenu, says, "Why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time?" And then I'm going to skip ahead to really the final verse of the entire scroll. "For truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us." That's not such a happy ending, needless to say. But tucked in, the penultimate verse, the second to last verse, is the verse that many of us know so well. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva, chadesh yamenu kakedem. And this one verse of all of these downers that we have in the Book of Lamentation, this one verse has such hope and renewal in it. It says here, this translation, which I don't love, but it says, "Take us back, Adonai, to yourself." We might also say, "Return us, cause us to return to you, God, and we will come back, we will return." And then it's such a simple phrase. It's 3 words in Hebrew, Chadesh Yamenu Kakedem, but it's almost like a paradox. It's really kind of an unusual sentence. Renew our days, or even just make new our days, as of old, like before. So how do we do that exactly? How do we make something brand new like it was in the past? So that is our challenge in particular for these holy days. We began singing this evening with Return, and it included that Hashivenu text. And certainly we are not only at a cyclical special time of our calendar when the calendar is about to reset on the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. But you might say, why do we even sing this text when we return the Torah? Well, the Torah itself we know is a cycle as well. On Simchat Torah, we celebrate our finishing of that cycle of Torah and that we immediately begin again. So it might be a scroll that goes from one side to the other, but we turn that scroll and it is very cyclical and circular, and we go from beginning to end and end to beginning. So that is our theme, this text. I'm going to stop the share because I don't think we need to look at these simple words, but I'll use them a little bit. So that is our theme for these holidays, this idea of returning and cycles and renewal, but also that little paradox of making new like it was as of old. So rather than that newer song by Noah Aronson that we sang earlier, I'm going to look at a little bit more of a traditional musical setting for Hashivenu that I think just beautifully expresses in purely musical terms what this perhaps can all mean. So I'm sure you're familiar with this tune as well. It's actually a round, so right off the bat, it of course represents this idea of turning and returning because a round keeps on going. It doesn't, we stop at some point, but we really don't have to. It could just keep on going. So it's a 3-part round, and the first part goes like this. Hashivenu, Hashivenu. I'm not even going to finish the first line because right there, what a beautiful musical idea of turning and returning. It feels like those 2 chords and that repetition of the one word, Hashivenu, cause us to return, could just go on forever. We could go Hashivenu, 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 Hashivenu. But it does go on. Adonai Elecha. Cause us return Adonai to you. The second part. Venashuva, Venashuva. And we will return, and we will return. That one word repeated twice. And the third part, make new our days like before, like as of old. Hadesh, Hadesh, Yameinu Kakedem. Which leads us right back to the beginning. Again, it's not an ending, but rather just one point on that circle. Hashivenu. And it could go on and on and on. So we have this cyclical experience of this idea of turning and returning. But we're going to get into it a little bit more because we have that strange and unique statement, Chadesh Yamenu, make our days new, Kakedem, like in the past. So how exactly do we make our days new like they were before? Are we going back or are we going forward? I think one of the best ways to explain this, I know we're talking about music, but I'm going to tell a short story that my brother, who's an architect, shared with me. He is an architect who's done quite a bit of renovation and restoration. And actually, I'm sure you've been in some of the buildings that he renovated and restored. Two of the seminal projects that he worked on many years ago were Radio City Music Hall and Central Synagogue, obviously both in Manhattan. Now, I said renovation and restoration because those things aren't exactly the same, and I think that's what we're alluding to here in Hashivenu. Make new our days like before. He explained to me, and this pertained to both Radio City and a Central Synagogue, if you've been in those spaces, they have beautiful ornament and rich colors, and it's such just an amazing interior. So if you were merely going to restore those buildings, and so this was actually Central Synagogue he was talking about in particular, they took samples of the original stenciling and looked at all the original colors and what those might be. And if they were just going to do a pure restoration, in other words, like before, go to the past, they would say, what are those colors? And they would, match those colors precisely and do the stenciling just like it was before. But their idea was to actually make it new like it was before. So how was that different? Well, he explained to me that the lighting was very, very different. That when the synagogue was built in the 19th century, it would have been gas lamps and certainly no electricity, and the lighting was much dimmer than modern lighting. And they weren't able to do the kinds of things that we can do now with lighting. So the synagogue has these beautiful chandeliers, but they have now LED bulbs and certainly much brighter light comes from these. So they actually had to change the colors of the stenciling and all the interior. It wasn't just to restore it to the original, but to make it feel like it did before by making it new. And actually many of the colors used in both of those buildings was actually a duller and not quite as bright a color as there was originally, because you wanted a sense of like it was before. In order to do that in today's world, it meant actually doing it differently in a new way. And so that's what this idea of Hashivenu, Chadesh Yamenu, of making our days new, but like they were before, I think that's what that means. And here's how I'm going to end with how our song, this beautiful round setting, how it creates that sense as well. So I said at the end of the third part, when we sing, Hadesh, Hadesh, Yamenu Kakedem. Now I'm singing this song in B minor. Here's a little bit of music theory, but if that isn't your thing, I'll make it clear. We're in the key of B minor. I began Hashivenu with a B minor chord and singing the note B. When I ended, Kakedem, again a B minor chord, and I ended on the note B. But I didn't end on the same note. I ended on an octave higher, which for the scientists among you, an octave is the same pitch, but it's actually double the frequency. So you have the same sense of pitch, this note versus this note, but twice as high. So it takes us back to where we were, but actually in a new, higher place. So before we conclude, we start all the way down here. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha. We've now come higher, actually a fifth higher. Venashuva, Venashuva. We're quite a bit higher. We're actually a third above the octave. Chadesh, Chadesh, Yamenu Kakedem. And the perfect musical resolution explaining that text, we've come back to the home base, but in a new place as well, the higher octave. So we'll sing one last time for you to think about of all those musical ideas and how that might help us in our work of teshuva, of returning, as we say, Hashivenu, cause us, Adonai, to return, and we will return to you. Make our days new as before. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yamenu Kakedem. L'shana tova.
So I have for you a little bit of a different experience or a little different modality. Yashikoa to you, Randall, and it's such a pleasure to pray with you and all of the Temple Israel of New Rochelle community. So what I have for you is I was invited to a book group this summer, and it happened to be with the author of the book. So I've been kind of pondering this book, and it's Edgar Carrett's not latest version of short stories, but it's his memoir from a few years ago, entitled The 7 Good Years. And it chronicles, so you have context, the year his son was born to right after his father dies. And it's this, him kind of lifting up, what it's like to be here. And if you've never read his work, he is one of the preeminent writers in Israel right now. And he also is a surrealist. So even in his memoir, he comes off a little surreal, and he really focuses on short stories. So I have a short story for you that I'm going to unpack a little bit as we go. And then I have a couple of things for us to hopefully take away from it. It's entitled Swede Dreams. He had an excellent translator with his nice little puns that he tosses in. My last visit to the Gothenburg Book Fair in Sweden got off to a stressful start. Several weeks before I arrived in that peaceful city, which boasts Northern Europe's largest amusement park, a local tabloid published a story accusing Israel of harvesting organs from Palestinians killed by the IDF. The story managed to make an impressive quantum leap in logic by linking an unproven accusation against the Israeli army for something it had allegedly done in the early 1990s to a New Jersey rabbi accused of trafficking in human organs in 2009, as if the gap of more than a decade and thousands of miles were merely a trivial detail. The only thing missing in the article was a recipe for matzahs made with the blood of Christian children. So just a pause there to contextualize. The thing he's pointing to is how this description of Israelis harvesting organs is really a clear call to the blood libels from the Middle Ages. And it really, made a tumult in the Jewish world, again, over 10 years ago. And he's arriving into this space where they had written about this. The absurd report, he continues, received a no less absurd response from the Israeli government, which demanded that the Swedish prime minister apologize for the story. The Swedes refused, of course, claiming freedom of the press, even if in this specific case, the press was not of particularly high quality. And Israel responded immediately with the unconventional weapon it keeps hidden away for conflicts of just such magnitude: a consumer boycott of IKEA. In the midst of this hyperventilated political storm, yours truly found himself spending Rosh Hashanah with an audience of polite Swedish readers who generously thanked him for his stories, but also kept an eye open while he autographed their books to make sure he didn't take advantage of the moment to snatch a kidney or two. But my real Swedish drama began when I realized there was a danger that I might not get back to Israel before Yom Kippur. Over the past few years, I've spent quite a few holidays outside of Israel. And despite the self-pitying, whiny face I always present to people around me, I have to admit I've often felt somewhat relieved to spend an Independence Day without an aerial demonstration of Air Force planes right over my head, or a Shavuot Eve minus aunts and uncles who were insulted because I've refused their invitation to a holiday dinner. But I always did everything I could to be in Israel on Yom Kippur. All these years, all my life. The night after the problem of my flight back was solved, with the help of my host's savvy travel agent, I invited everyone to celebrate our success at a local Swedish restaurant called, for some reason, Krakow, which is famous, of course, for its huge selection of Czech beers. Just a side note, I did look it up because I was curious, and Krakow still exists to this day if you wanted to try and, when all of this is over, go over and have a delicious Czech beer. He continues, now that it's all been worked out, maybe you can explain to us what the heck is so special about that holiday, my young Swedish publisher asked. And so I found myself with a stomach full of cold potato salad and draft beer, trying to explain to a few half-drunk literary Swedes what Yom Kippur is. The Swedes listened and were fascinated. The thought of a day when no motorized vehicles drive through the cities, when people walk around without their wallets and all the stores are closed, when there are no TV broadcasts or even updates on websites, to them sounded more like an innovative Naomi Klein concept than an ancient Jewish holiday. The fact that it was also a day when you're supposed to ask others for forgiveness and do moral stock taking upgraded the anti-consumerist angle with a welcome touch of 60s hippiedom. And the fasting bit sounded like an extreme version of the fashionable low-carb diet they talked to me about in such glowing terms just that morning. And so I began the evening trying to explain the ancient Hebrew ritual in my broken English, and found myself doing PR for the coolest, most sought-after holiday in the universe, the iPhone of all festivals. At that point, the amazed Swedes were consumed by envy of me for having been born into such a wonderful religion. Their eyes darted around the restaurant, looking at the patrons as if they were searching for a moil who would cut them a deal to join up. 26 hours later, I was strolling with my wife down the center lane of one of Tel Aviv's busiest thoroughfares, our little son behind us, riding his bike with the training wheels. Above us, birds were chirping their morning bird song. I've spent my whole adult life on that street, but only on Yom Kippur do I get to hear the birds. Daddy, my son asked as he pedaled and panted, tomorrow's Yom Kippur too, right? No, son, I said, tomorrow's a regular day. He burst into tears. I stood in the middle of the street watching the kid cry. Come on, my wife whispered to me, say something to him. There's nothing to be said, love, I whispered back. The child is right. So if you've never been in Israel on Yom Kippur, I want to share with you a little bit of it. This is 2 minutes of it, as presented by the Times of Israel in 2017 in Tel Aviv. So I wanted you to have kind of just a taste of what it's like to be in Israel on Yom Kippur, because it's so dramatically different. And I have two main takeaways for you from this story. One is the way in which his son expressed his pain. I know that we're all in pain right now. I know how much I want to be in our main sanctuary next week, and not on Zoom. And I want to lie down and cry and scream, but it's not socially acceptable. So I just wanted to appreciate the way in which the honest pain was recognized in that story, in the way that we can't gather the way we should. The second is the way in which Yom Kippur evolved in Israel. They came there and they decided that not everyone was going to experience Yom Kippur as the religious holiday that we know and love here in the States. And they figured out how to make it not just a religious day, but also to make it a civilly religious day, to have that civil religion mixed up in there. And to create something dramatically new such that it pained Edgar to not be there and to experience the world stopping and the chance to just walk through the streets and hear the birds chirp in a way that he normally doesn't get to. As we are all embarking on these new high holidays in a way that we've never done them before, I just want to encourage all of you to, yes, please, we look forward to you joining us and to praying with us through the power of technology so that we can all be alone together and say these ancient words, but also to try and take a little bit of that Israeli ingenuity, maybe find a moment of that quiet, to turn everything off, pretend that the world doesn't exist, and just embrace the power of the day in the way they do every single year in Israel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Levy, and all of my colleagues for your beautiful teachings tonight. It's customary during the month of Elul to read and reread Psalm 27, a text that through our repeated reading of it helps us to deepen into introspection as part of our preparation for the internal work of the high holidays. At each of the Kabbalat Shabbat services at WRT in the last month, we've sung the text of Achat Sha'alti, which famously comes from this psalm. I thought it might be interesting to take a closer look at the first few verses of that psalm together. LeDavid Adonai, Ori v'yish'i mimi ira. A psalm of David. Adonai is my light and my help. Whom should I fear? Adonai is the stronghold of my life. Whom should I dread? When evil men assail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Should an army besiege me, my heart would not be afraid. Should war beset me, still I would be confident and sure. One thing I ask of Adonai, only that do I seek, to live in the house of Adonai all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of Adonai, and to dwell in God's holy temple. In this first verse, we see Adonai is my light. Whom should I fear? And yet we do fear. We have feared greatly during the last 6 months, anxious and worried for ourselves, our loved ones, our friends, our communities. In verse 3, we see, should an army besiege me, my heart would not be afraid. Well, a pandemic has besieged us and our hearts have been afraid. You'll notice if you look closely that each of these verses contains a psik, this vertical short line that you see after the first word or two of each verse. A psik is pronounced as a slight pause, and it's meant to provide emphasis, to highlight the word that preceded it. In the first verse, you'll see that there's a psik after the word Adonai, and in the fourth verse, you'll see it's right after achat, meaning one. Just like the Shema, which declares that Adonai echad, Adonai is one, here too in Psalm 27, we are reminded of this unity. And it's not just about God, it's all one. The light and the fear, they are one and the same. Light would not be experienced as such if it were not for darkness, and vice versa. They are inextricably linked, only understood in relation to one another. Achat Sha'alti, this fourth verse here, is all about this unity. The person who composed the psalm wrote, "One thing, only one thing I ask of Adonai," and then proceeded to list more than one petition. Perhaps they did so because they knew that all of those requests really are one. They all express a longing for closeness with something bigger than ourselves, a source of light in times of fear and darkness. One of these requests is to live in the house of God all the days of our lives. Well, we have been dwelling in our homes all the days of our lives for the past 6 months. And so as we prepare for the High Holy Days, how can we help make our kitchens and our living rooms feel a little more like God's house? Perhaps we could do that through song. In verse 6 of the psalm, we read, "And now my head shall be held high over my enemies who surround me, and I shall sacrifice in God's tent with zivchei teruah, shouts of joy and shofar blasts. I shall sing and I shall praise Adonai." Perhaps we overcome our fears and simultaneously find the light by singing through those fears, worries, and anxieties. We connect with ourselves, our loved ones, and with God through our voices, the pure expression of our souls. And so, let me stop the screen share. And so, let us sing and remember that it is all one, the fear and the light, and that we too can make our homes into God's holy sanctuary. This is Achat Sha'alti by Chava Morel. שאלתי מאת אדוני, אחת שאלתי אותה אבקש, אחת שאלתי מאת אדוני, אחת שאלתי אותה אבקש. שבתי שבתי בבית אדוני, שבתי שבתי כל ימי חיי, לחזות בנועם אדוני ולבקר בהיכלו, לחזות בנועם אדוני, to gaze upon the beauty of Adonai. One thing I ask you, Adonai, to be with you all of my life. One thing I ask you, Adonai, to be with you all of my life. אחת שאלתי מאת אדוני, אחת שאלתי אותה אבקש. We now transition to our ritual of Havdalah, a ceremony of separation which we engage in every week, but this week feels special because we say goodbye to the last Shabbat of 5780 and enter the week during which we will begin 5781 with Rosh Hashanah on Shabbat. And so we use this ritual usually to bring with us the sweetness of Shabbat into the rest of the week. But here we are at the cusp of a new year, and we can decide what are the sweetnesses we're going to bring with us into the new year. Now, this year feels different in that regard because maybe there are a lot of things that we don't want to bring with us into 5781, and I would not blame you for feeling that way. And so perhaps this is an opportunity for us to begin thinking about tonight and this whole week. What are the sweet things you're bringing? Perhaps the silver linings of more time with family, more time spent outdoors. And what are the things we want to leave behind that we don't want to bring into this new year? Ways that we want to be and ways we don't want to be. And so we begin Havdalah. הנה אל ישועתי אבטח ולא אפחד, כי עוזי וזמרתיה אדוני ויהי לי לישועה. ושאבתם מים בששון ממעייני הישוע. אדוני הישוע, על עמך ברכתך סלה. אדוני צבאות עמנו, משגב לנו, אלוהי יעקב סלה. אדוני צבאות, אשרי אדם בוטח בך. אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו, ביום קוראנו. ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר, כן תהיה לנו. כוס ישועות אשא, ובשם אדוני אקרא. ליהודים הייתה אורה, הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון ויקר. ליהודים הייתה אורה, הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון ויקר. כן תהיה לנו, תהיה לנו, תהיה לנו. כן תהיה לנו, תהיה לנו, תהיה לנו. ליהודים הייתה אורה, הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון ויקר. ליהודים הייתה אורה, הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון ויקר. As we move into the Havdalah blessings, if you would like to join in with us by grabbing a Kiddush cup full of grape juice or wine, something to smell for the spices, even an orange that you can scratch the skin and smell the freshness, and perhaps a braided candle. If not, just be with us, but you can also bring your own items.
Shavua Tov. Yasher Koach, and thank you to my colleagues for this beautiful teaching and Havdalah. We're so grateful to you, and we're so grateful to our congregation. We know that you're tuning in on 3 different streaming platforms through the Westchester Reform Temple website, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. So thank you for being with us. We're about to go into our Selichot prayers. So maybe just take a moment, stretch your legs, reach up with your thoughts, do what you need to do to recalibrate your senses. We've just taken in a little bit of the sweet taste of Havdalah. We're still capturing a little bit of this Shabbat that is now in the rearview mirror, which means that it is now officially the last week of 5780, and we are marching steadily forward with hope, with anticipation, with joy, toward 5781, which will begin with the setting of the sun this coming Shabbat. So we're going to pray together with words for the season. Our colleague Cantor Schloss taught us Hashivenu tonight. And in English, we hear those words again, we return.
We return, we return, we return, we return, we return, return again. We return, we return, we return, we return, we return, return again and again to
White butterflies with single black finger paint eyes on their wings dart and settle eddy and mate over the green tangle of vines in Labor Day morning stream. The year grinds into ripeness and rot, grapes darkening, pears yellowing, the first Virginia creeper twining crimson, the grasses dry straw to burn. The new year rises, beckoning across the umbrella on the sand. I begin to reconsider my life. What is the yield of my impatience? What is the fruit of my resolve? I turn from my frantic white dance over the jungle of productivity, and slowly an igun slides, cold water down my throat. I rest on a leaf spotted red. Now is the time to let the mind search backwards like the raven loosed to see what can feed us. Now the time to cast the mind forward, to chart an aerial map of the months. The new year is a great door that stands across the evening, and Yom Kippur is the second door. Between them are song and silence, stone and clay pot to be filled within myself. I will find there both ripeness and rot, what I have done and undone, what I must let go with the waning days, and what I must take in. With the last tomatoes, we harvest the fruit of our lives.
Mochel avonot amo, ma'avir rishon, marbe mechila lechatayim, uslicha lefoshim, ose tzedakot, im kol basar veruach l'chiratam tigmol, l'chiratam tigmol, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai. At Sinai, you revealed 13 attributes of mercy. These aspects of your nature, your very essence, we now recall. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet, Notzer Chesed la'olafim, Noseh Avon v'Fesha, V'Chata v'Nakeh. Adonai, Adonai, God, compassionate, gracious, endlessly patient, loving, and true, showing mercy to the 1000th generation, forgiving evil, defiance, and wrongdoing, granting pardon.
Ke
Adonai al yereav kechigvo hashamayim al haaretz kavar chasto al yereav kirachem al banim recham Adonai al yereav tivo hashamayim al haaretz kavar chasto al
Moses prayed to God, "As you have been faithful to this people ever since Egypt, please forgive their failings now, in keeping with your boundless love." And God responded, "I forgive as you have asked." In darkening shade lies city street, in deepening shadow, wood and meadow. And barren and shallow are thoughts tonight. Through blackened window, through tight closed door, no wind can wander, no light can enter. Empty our hearts, and fallow and blight. Now do we ask of you, deep in your universe, far in your wanderings, Maker so merciful, open your cloud banks to moon full and bright. Let moonlight illumine us. Night winds come brushing us. Breath of your presence be felt in our souls.
And now another beautiful Piute, liturgical poem. This one's an alphabetical acrostic that we hear only on this night of Selichot. It begins with the words B'motzei menucha, as we bid farewell, as we conclude this day of rest. We come before you, God, and each verse of the poem is punctuated with these words, Lishmoa el harina ve'el hatfilah, O God, hear our song and our prayer. B'motzei menucha, kidamnu chatchila, hatoznecha mimarom, Yoshev tehila, lishmoa el harina v'el hatfila, lishmoa el harina v'el hatfila. Shabbat has ended. Still we stand before you. O God of praises, hearken from on high. O hear our song and our prayer.
As you reached out for the sake of Isaac, beloved son who gave himself to you, cover his children who cry to you this night with your protecting shield. O hear our song and our prayer. Draw near and turn to all who turn to you. Embrace all who seek you with a whole heart. From heaven's heights turn to us. O hear our song and our prayer.
Lishmoa el harina v'el hatfila, Lishmoa el harina v'el hatfila.
God, with fear and trembling, we stand before you, humbly beseeching, blot out our transgressions, as in your presence we shake like a woman in travail. O hear our song and prayer. Just creator of the world's every creature, keeper and sustainer of all, sustain us now. With love you have shown us from the first. O hear our song and our prayer.
Lishmoa el harina v'el hatfila,
Many are the sins of your people, too many to count. Nevertheless, we plead for mercy, exalted one, on all who stand before you. O hear our song and our prayer. Pity our suffering, overlook our sins. Remember our need when you hear our plea, God of the hosts of heaven. Spare us, gracious God, and cleanse all who cry out to you. O hear our song and our prayer. This night may our offering be acceptable, our vows received with favor as the sacrifices of old. Wondrous God, maker of miracles, make us to see the miracle of forgiveness. O hear our song and our prayer.
So on this Selichot night, I want to share with you a story that I learned about this time last year, but not in enough time to share it with you on the high holidays last year. And that's just as well because it seems to fit this holiday season even more aptly than it would have made sense for last year. The story is called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate, and it's by the science fiction author Ted Chiang, who is perhaps most famous for writing a short story, a little novella, called The Stories of Your Life, The Story of Your Life, which was turned into the movie Arrival, which was about first contact with an alien species and starred Amy Adams. So many of you may have seen the movie Arrival. I thought it was a wonderful movie. The book is even better. And the newest collection of short stories and novellas by Ted Chiang, called Exhalation Stories, is even better than his last collection in which that story is included. So I'm going to bring up on screen an excerpt from the very end of the first story in the collection. But I commend to you not only the entire story, but indeed the entire book, because it's a marvelous collection of short stories, and in this case, really a novella. The book opens with this very large story, long story. I'll give you just a little bit of setup so you understand. So the narrator that we're going to hear from is a man who lives in the Middle East, whose name is Fuad. And the genre context for this story, the style of the story, is Arabic folklore. It feels like you are reading kind of a take on 1001 Arabian Nights, and that's intentional. And I've listened to some interviews with the author where he describes his inspiration coming exactly from that kind of Middle Eastern folkloric genre. And in the story, Fuad happens to encounter a merchant in Baghdad who has a store of all sorts of curiosities and intricate wares for sale, but whose prize in his collection is a specific gate that one can walk through and emerge either in the future or in the past. So this is actually a sci-fi story about time travel, except as you proceed through the story, you realize it's not actually a story about time travel in the sci-fi sense. It's actually something that I would describe more as speculative philosophy. It talks about the question of, well, what if we could revisit our past and then return to the present day? What if we could travel into the future to meet our future selves and find out how our lives had turned out? And like much folklore, this first story is also recursive. So we meet Fuad, who enters into conversation with the merchant, who introduces him to the special gate through which he can travel in time several times in the story. And Fuad is all the while contemplating whether or not to step through the gate himself and find out what his life has in store, or whether or not he could go back into his own past and therefore change the course of events. But all along, the merchant cautions him and says, look, you can travel backward into your own past, but things are the way they are. You actually don't have the power to change the course of events. Nor, if you meet your future self, will any conversations you have actually have any bearing on the way in which the future plays out. Nevertheless, after hearing the stories of a number of others, 3 others who had made this journey in time, Fuad is intrigued enough to try it himself. And this is where his story, which is actually the last mini story within the story, begins. The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate by Ted Chiang, an excerpt. I was married once, 20 years before, to a woman named Najia. Her figure swayed as gracefully as a willow bough, and her face was as lovely as the moon. But it was her kind and tender nature that captured my heart. I had just begun my career as a merchant when we were married, and we were not wealthy, but did not feel the lack. We had been married only a year when I was to travel to Basra to meet with a ship's captain. I had an opportunity to profit by trading in slaves, but Najia did not approve. On the morning of my departure, Najia and I argued. I spoke harshly to her, using words that it shames me to recall, and I beg your Majesty's forgiveness if I do not repeat them here. I left in anger and never saw her again. She was badly injured when the wall of a mosque collapsed some days after I left. She was taken to the Bimaristan, but the physicians could not save her, and she died soon after. I did not learn of her death until I returned a week later, and I felt as if I had killed her with my own hand. Can the torments of hell be worse than what I endured in the days that followed? It seemed likely that I would find out, so near to death did my anguish take me. And surely the experience must be similar, for like internal fire, grief burns but does not consume. Instead, it makes the heart vulnerable to further suffering. Eventually my period of lamentation ended, and I was left a hollow man, a bag of skin with no innards. I freed the slaves I had bought and became a fabric merchant. Over the years I became wealthy, but I never remarried. Some of the men I did business with tried to match me with a sister or a daughter, telling me that the love of a woman can make you forget your pains. Perhaps they are right, but it cannot make you forget the pain you caused another. Whenever I imagined myself marrying another woman, I remembered the look of hurt in Najia's eyes when I last saw her, and my heart was closed to others. I spoke to a mullah about what I had done, and it was he who told me that repentance and atonement erase the past. I repented and atoned as best I knew how. For 20 years I lived as an upright man. I offered prayers and fasted and gave alms to those less fortunate and made pilgrimage to Mecca, and yet I was still haunted by guilt. And now here I've taken out a large chunk, again, just for the sake of time, but I would warmly encourage you to read the story. Now, we pick up the story. He has now stepped through the gate, and he has traveled back 20 years into his own past. So he's going back to the scene of the crime, as it were, back to this trauma in his past that he wants to revisit, even though he has been cautioned, as I told you, that nothing he can do will change the course of the events of his life. He still is so tempted to go back and see what he can learn from this trauma that has had such a devastating impact on his life. So here we are in the past. The day of Najia's accident was fast approaching, and I grew desperate. I solicited each of the camel drivers in turn, trying to hire one to take me ahead alone, but could not persuade any of them. Eventually, I found one willing to sell me a camel at what would have been an exorbitant price under ordinary circumstances, but which I was all too willing to pay. I then struck out on my own. It will come as no surprise that I made little progress in the storm, but when the wind subsided, I immediately adopted a rapid pace. Without the soldiers that accompanied the caravan, however, I was an easy target for bandits, and sure enough, I was stopped after 2 days' ride. They took my money and the camel I had purchased, but spared my life. Whether out of pity or because they could not be bothered to kill me, I do not know. I began walking back to rejoin the caravan, but now the skies tormented me with their cloudlessness, and I suffered from the heat. By the time the caravan found me, my tongue was swollen, and my lips were as cracked as mud baked by the sun. After that, I had no choice but to accompany the caravan at its usual pace. Like a fading rose that drops its petals one by one, my hopes dwindled with each passing day. By the time the caravan reached the city of peace, I knew it was too late. But the moment we rode through the city gates, I asked the guardsmen if they had heard of a mosque collapsing. The first guardsman I spoke to had not, and for a heartbeat I dared to hope that I had misremembered the date of the accident and that I had in fact arrived in time. And then another guardsman told me that a mosque had indeed collapsed just yesterday in the Kark quarter. His words struck me with the force of the executioner's axe. I had traveled so far only to receive the worst news of my life a second time. I walked to the mosque and saw the piles of bricks where there had once been a wall. It was a scene that had haunted my dreams for 20 years, but now the image remained, even after I opened my eyes, and with a clarity sharper than I could endure. I turned away and walked without aim, blind to what was around me, until I found myself before my old house, the one where Najia and I had lived. I stood in the street in front of it, filled with memory and anguish. I do not know how much time had passed when I became aware that a young woman had walked up to me. "My lord," she said, "I'm looking for the house of Fuad ibn Abbas." "You have found it," I said. "Are you Fuad ibn Abbas, my lord?" "I am, and I ask you, please leave me be." "My lord, I beg your forgiveness. My name is Maimuna, and I assist the physicians at the Bimaristan. I tended to your wife before she died." I turned to look at her. "You tended to Najia?" "I did, my lord. I am sworn to deliver a message to you from her." "What message?" "She wished me to tell you that her last thoughts were of you. She wished me to tell you that while her life was short, it was made happy by the time she spent with you." She saw the tears streaming down my cheeks and said, "Forgive me if my words cause you pain, my lord." "There is nothing to forgive, child. Would that I had the means to pay you as much as this message is worth to me, because a lifetime of thanks would still leave me in your debt." "Grief owes no debt," she said. "Peace be upon you, my lord." "Peace be upon you," I said. She left, and I wandered the streets for hours crying tears of release. All the while I thought on the truth of Basharat's words. That's the merchant who owns the magical gate. Past and future are the same, and we cannot change either, only know them more fully. My journey to the past had changed nothing, but what I had learned had changed everything, and I understood that it could not have been otherwise. Now I've excerpted a little bit more to the very end. Now my tale has caught up to my life, coiled as they both are, and the direction they take next is for your majesty to decide. I know many things that will happen here in Baghdad over the next 20 years, but nothing about what awaits me now. I have no money for the journey back to Cairo and the gate of years there, yet I count myself fortunate beyond measure, for I was given the opportunity to revisit my past mistakes, and I have learned what remedies Allah allows. I would be honored to relate everything I know of the future if your majesty sees fit to ask, but for myself the most precious knowledge I possess is this. Nothing erases the past. There is repentance, there is atonement, and there is forgiveness. That is all, but that is enough. And if that is not a high holiday story, well then I do not know what is. So you have an invitation, maybe even a little bit of homework before the high holidays, which is, after all, the whole point of Selichot. We don't start the high holidays with a bolt out of the blue when the sun sets on Erev Rosh Hashanah. We actually have Selichot precisely for the purpose of cheshbon hanefesh, starting the process of introspection, of spiritual evaluation. Or, as a bar mitzvah boy just this morning at Westchester Reform Temple memorably put it, Yom Kippur is our invitation to go back and, like a good athlete, review our unforced errors from the last year. I thought that that was an exquisitely timeless way of putting it, and well suited to this young man who's also a budding athlete. And maybe with a little help from his Devar Torah coach, Rabbi Reeser. What unforced errors do you need to revisit? What from your past still holds you in its grip and will not let go? If it is grief, if it is trauma, if it is guilt, now's the time to go back, not for the purpose of self-flagellation. We don't revisit our past in order to re-inflict the hurt. We do it so that we can learn and grow. And ultimately, I think in the very beautiful and hopeful spirit of the story, to release ourselves. There is atonement, there is repentance, and there is forgiveness. That is all, but that is enough. Shana Tova. We'll continue now with the concluding prayers of our worship for Selichot.
Shema Kolenu, hear our voices, Adonai. Have compassion on us, and in mercy accept our prayer. Shema Kolenu, Adonai.
When I was young and learned the alphabet, life was open to me. A was full of aspiration, B was for beauty, C for confidence, and D for dreams, and so on through the list. No fewer than 26 opportunities, 26 possibilities. And yet I fear that with the passage of time, I've squandered them, creating instead A's of apathy, B's of brusqueness, and C's of coarseness. Help me then to return to that innocence. Let the letters be letters once again, and let them rise to the heavens and form into the words that you know I wish to say. We now pray silently together.
Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, tavo lefanecha tefillatenu. Ve'al titalam mitchinatenu. Shein anachnu הזפנים וקשי עורף, לומר לפניך אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, צדיקים אנחנו ולא חטאנו. אנחנו חטאנו. The suffix nu means us, and ordinarily after each of these sins we would all repeat them to hear our voices together. So while we might not be able to hear you, I will make sure to leave a little bit of space between each word of this alphabetic acrostic so that you might sing them all together even if we can't hear one another. Ay 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 ay. Ay 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 ay. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu, dibarnu dofi. Ay 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 ay. Avinu v'hirshanu zanu chamasnu tafalnu shaker. Ay 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 ay. Yatnura kizavnu latnu maranu niatnu sararnu avinu pashanu tsararnu kishinu oref. Ay 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 ay. Rashanu, Shechatnu, Tiavnu, Tainu, Titanu. Ay, 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 yeah, 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 yeah.
Answer us, you who have answered our mother Sarah in her old age, you who answered our father Abraham on Mount Moriah, you who answered their son Isaac when bound upon the altar. You who answered Rebekah when she cried, "Why do I exist?" You who answered Jacob at Bethel, "Israel shall be your name." You who answered Leah in her sadness, you who answered Rachel in her pain, you who answered Joseph in the prison house. You who answered the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, at the birthing stones. You who answered Yocheved's courage on the bank of the Nile. You who answered our fathers and our mothers at the Sea of Reeds. You who answered Moses at Sinai, I bore you on eagle's wings. You who answered Miriam at the well. You who answered Aaron, who served with incense and fire. You who answered the daughters of Zelophehad, who stood up for their rights before Moses and God. You who answered Elijah with a still small voice in the wilderness. You who answered the righteous ones before us, men and women of integrity and compassion, answer us.
Ki anu amecha ve'ata Eloheinu, anu vanecha ve'ata Avinu, anu avadecha ve'ata Adonenu, anu kehalecha ve'ata chelkenu, anu nachalatecha ve'ata goralenu, anu tzonecha ve'ata ro'enu, anu charmecha ve'ata notrenu, anu feulatecha ve'ata yotzrenu, anu rayatecha ve'ata dodenu, anu segulatecha ve'ata kerovenu, anu amecha ve'ata malkenu, anu ma'amirecha ve'ata mamirenu.
We conclude our service together this evening with two sounds that are symbolic of the holidays, two iconic sounds of this season. First, with the singing of Avinu Mulcanu, and then with the sounding of the shofar. Avinu Mulcanu, Choneinu Vaneinu, Avinu Mulcanu, Choneinu Vaneinu, Ki ein banu masim, Aseh imanu, Tzedakah v'chesed, Aseh imanu, Tzedakah v'chesed, V'hoshienu, Avinu Mulcanu, Choneinu Vaneinu, Avinu Mulcanu, Chonenu vanenu, ki ein banu maasim.
And so we arrive at the final moment of our Selichot, our penitential service on this Saturday that anticipates the new year. We pray that each of you will experience a High Holy Days that brings inspiration and joy, a little extra love into your heart, a little bit of extra patience and understanding when you become impatient with all of the challenges that have been thrust upon us by the recalibration of our lives in this time of COVID-19. Above all, we pray that we will be blessed with safety, health, and joy. If you are so moved, you can stand at this time as we now hear the sound of the shofar.
Tekiah Gedolah.
Shana Tova. We look forward to greeting you on Rosh Hashanah. For all of our community at Westchester Reform Temple and all of our friends at Temple of Israel of New Rochelle, we wish you a very sweet and happy New Year. Thank you for joining us tonight. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.